Alright, and now moving on to the fourth meditation, and just to sort of recap, and I guess we should probably pigeonhole this in before we really get going and understand really what Descartes' going to do here. And we have to put him in this sort of context of, the way truth, goodness, and existence kind of has this sort of synthesis of being considered, good and great virtues, the kind of Aristotelian sort of ethics and, education that Descartes went about through his experiences that he talked about. So it's important to perhaps put that in and understand how he's going to go about his system, because he's going to talk about, the goodness of existence, and that's important for his ontological arguments of God and things like the fifth meditations and etc. that we'll go over in this video. And so, to recap, going into the fourth meditation, he understands and recaps that you can only have, an intellectual, rational conception of a God. And so he wants to lay to rest that he can have this sort of idea of God, and it won't be deceptive. It's not the kind of misapprehension that he talks about in other ways through the imagination and just through the senses themselves. And so he wants to point out that we are ultimately these finite creatures who can't really rationalize a greater picture of the kind of one, if you will. So how can we have this kind of perception and understanding, or at least, the innate sort of idea, as he would put it, of infinity in creatures that weren't infinite themselves? And so how would we also understand something like perfection unless it existed somewhere? And he'll later point out that, ideas and what they actually are, its realness in the material world, perhaps. There's a reason to believe that it's, closely similar. And this kind of goes into his sort of causal arguments that we went in the last video on with, in regards to, his idea of, there's a causal kind of, equal chain of existence that he sort of picked up from this kind of scholastic teachings and whatnot. So yeah, it's important to kind of usher in that, scholastic existence is definitely important for Descartes. The idea that existence is perfection, and you are in the kind of in between of being the perfection of a perfect being and the imperfection of nothingness. You are kind of, in that sort of hierarchical stand in between. So you can't take the kind of full picture of understanding actually your own, incompetence if that were the case. You wouldn't be able to take in a kind of rational understanding of the universe and, where you are in relation to it without that kind of bigger picture. And Descartes obviously is trying to say, well, we can't really, do that. But, of course, this actually goes rather unquestioned for quite some time until, Kant comes along and says, well, this is kind of, neutral. This, I think, goes to show why Spengler kind of beats up on Kant all the time, because it kind of is the introduction of, the problematization of, kind of the indifference towards existence itself. It's no longer just this kind of good quality, non really questionable understanding of the two and their inseparable attitude, as opposed to the kind of neutral. We're actually putting this kind of quality into it. But yeah, that would be I guess, a sort of rundown of the fourth meditation. And now the fifth meditation is actually, my favorite in the entire meditation six-part series. He's going to introduce the concept of the triangle, and so you have the idea of the triangle in the head, and so in order for it to be a triangle, there has to be these necessary, truths to the type of triangle it could be. It has to be 180 degrees. It has to have it has to be three right angles. And this is also a play on imagination. When you imagine some sort of object or kind of abstraction that like he talks about, like what the 1,000 like face pentagon or something like that, whatever the example is. It's very hard and to actually visualize something like that. But the realness of the triangle, it's very easy to discern. It's very easy to access as compared to something that's far more complicated and requires a greater level of imagination. What does that mean? There seems to be some sort of realness to abstractions that are closer into the world. And of course, this is actually very, very revolutionary. This sort of taking of intellectual abstraction, that these sort of abstractions in our minds, we go out there and seek them. They're not in the world itself, and then we find them and then process it and sort of make this sort of abstract analytical sort of syllogism out of it, like Aristotle would suggest, or something like that. It's the material essence that he'll talk about later, and understanding that we actually have these sort of abstractions in our mind, these sort of a priori concepts, and we find them within the world. This is very revolutionary compared to prior philosophy. That it's important to take a look at this kind of step, because you're going to see with a lot of rationalist thought and videos to come on this channel after this, with Leibniz and others who will refute this. And obviously this also will lead into the kind of understanding of the mind and the body as separate entities, but nonetheless they are within your body, as Hobbes would probably have argued with Descartes. So why are you abstracting away from the body when they're inseparable? But that's Hobbes's take. But here with Descartes, he wants to show that there is these kind of differences between the mind and the body, and this ultimately does result in him trying to argue about the soul, and that it's actually something entirely separate, although he does want to use the kind of pineal gland to I guess from his day, the gland was like a singular, so to him in the kind of back of the brain, this would I think what does they call it, like the kind of seat of the soul, or something akin to that. But I guess just to hark back, since I kind of ran roughshod there for a few minutes and digressed quite a bit, just like the idea of the triangle is inseparable from its qualities of the 180 degrees, and it's sort of necessarily truthfulness to you being able to imagine or think of, imagine would be an inappropriate term, to think of such a triangle. Then what about the qualities of God in regards to existence? And so if it's already put, if it's put so that God and God's existence is, in your mind, and you can have these sort of innate intellectual abstract thoughts towards them, then just like the triangle, it necessarily has to exist within the intellect. And then this, of course, opens up to him proving material bodies and their relationship towards the mind and being a thinking thing, as he would say in the end, that he's not a body, but a mind capable of thought. He wants to point out that, senses, they're involuntary. My hands are kind of cold today because it's starting to get, fall-like out. I'm not telling myself that, hey, it's fall, so therefore my hands should be cold or something like that. It's involuntary. I don't choose for my hands to feel a bit uncomfortable today. So therefore it can't really be, an intellect or my own will. I'm not the cause of this, but nonetheless it is inflicted on my body. And so my body is an extension into space. And so you could either argue that, God is, putting this directly towards me, or that there is some sort of happening beyond just the senses of the body itself. And so he's, backing it into, extended spatial qualities, the ultimate universal quality of the body itself. And this is kind of, the Cartesian, physics that, helps establish Western thought from here on out. It is also important to point out, as well, that when it comes to, the mind, there is nothing within the mind, itself called, something like memory or imagination. And so you can't refer to the mind in this sort of way of trying to dissect, if you will. Descartes, was a very smart man who was into the kind of dissection of these things. This is how, he knows about the pineal gland and things like that. So for him, obviously, pointing out the difference between, these concepts of what's going on within the mind itself, doesn't exist actually within the mind. And I know this kind of sounds, from time to time a bit convoluted, but this is actually really important in the 17th century to establish, and actually kind of tied into my recent video on that debate with the socialists, right? Where, if you're a thinking thing, what is the relationship towards the material? What's the relationship towards, using the material and harnessing it for a changing consciousness? If we were going to kind of make a Steelman approach to that kind of line of thinking. Or is that even possible, would be a refutation of that. So yeah, this is actually very important stuff to understand, and obviously going into my other videos on psychology and the plaguing of mind today, and its sort of illnesses that could also obviously affect the senses and affect, the rational kind of spirit, if you will, within Descartes. An illness can affect that. And so when we look at, a mentally ill society that kind of has the traits of this sort of decadent material approach to things, it is perhaps important to emphasize, why we actually are thinking things in this sort of mind and body dualistic, worldview that ultimately equates back to him, showing that there is sort of this, soul. Although Descartes, many would accuse, he doesn't really talk about force or anything like that. What is, making, these material objects sort of move or have a sort of telos to it. That's actually something that he really didn't delve into enough if we were going to kind of do an introspective here of the meditations in the end here. But yeah, just to summarize, he wants to move on into the end by saying that he's a thinking thing before, just a body that senses, and ultimately to him sort of chases the tail and doesn't understand that there is these sort of a priori concepts within us, and that's actually how we can tap into the intellect of looking towards God and the epistemological attempts at proving him here, or at least the ontological argument in the fifth meditation and the causal argument in the third one. But yeah, very interesting stuff, and I think I might do a video perhaps towards his stuff on the passions and ethics, and maybe a little bit more on the will. We'll see, but yeah, thanks for watching, guys. It's just a little ramble video of the last couple meditations here.